At exactly 6:17 every morning, Sarah's cattle did something that made absolutely no sense. They walked toward the feeding trough. They looked at the hay. They sniffed it. And then they walked away. Not one cow, not two, all of them. Sarah had been raising cattle long enough to know that cows don't simply stop eating for no reason. So on the fourth morning, she decided to test something. She moved the feed to a completely different part of the farm. The cattle followed her. They looked at the new feeding area and immediately started eating. Sarah froze, because the feed wasn't the problem. Something was wrong with the place where she'd been feeding them, and what she discovered later that morning would force her to change the way she managed her cattle completely. Sarah had owned the small Midwest cattle farm for almost 7 years. She knew her herd. She knew which cow was aggressive around feeding time. She knew which one always pushed her way to the front. She even knew which calves preferred one side of the trough. So when the cattle suddenly stopped eating, Sarah noticed immediately. The first morning, she wasn't too worried. Maybe the hay wasn't as fresh. Maybe the weather had affected them. Maybe they simply weren't hungry. But the second morning was different. The cattle walked toward the trough, then stopped. One cow stretched her neck forward and sniffed the hay. She pulled her head back. Another cow did the same. Then the entire herd slowly turned away. Sarah stood there holding the gate. Okay? She looked at the hay. It looked normal. It smelled normal. There was no visible mold. No strange color. Nothing obviously wrong. And yet her cattle refused to touch it. Sarah didn't want to guess. She started with the feed. She pulled several handfuls of hay from different parts of the pile. She examined it carefully. Nothing. Then she checked the water. Clean. Fresh. The trough itself? Recently washed. She checked the mineral blocks. Normal. She even walked around the pasture looking for signs that something had frightened the herd. Nothing. By afternoon, the cattle were clearly hungry. And that worried Sarah more than the strange behavior itself. A healthy cow doesn't simply decide to go without food for several days. So Sarah called her local veterinarian. The vet examined the cattle. Their temperatures were normal. Their eyes looked healthy. Their stomach activity didn't suggest a major digestive problem. There were no obvious signs of infection. The vet looked at Sarah and said something that made the mystery even stranger. They're hungry. Sarah frowned. I know. The vet smiled slightly. No, I mean they're really hungry. They're choosing not to eat. That sentence stayed in Sarah's head. Choosing not to eat. But why? The following morning, Sarah decided to conduct a simple experiment. Instead of filling the usual trough, she placed fresh hay on the opposite side of the pasture. She didn't change the hay. She didn't add supplements. She didn't mix anything into it. She simply moved it. Then she opened the gate. The cattle walked out. Sarah watched. One cow approached the new feeding area. She lowered her head. She took a bite. Then another cow followed. Within seconds, the entire herd was eating. Sarah's eyes widened. She walked over to the old feeding area. The hay sitting there was exactly the same. Same supplier, same bale, same smell, same appearance. But the cattle refused to touch it. Sarah stood quietly for several seconds. Then she looked down at the ground around the old trough. That's when she noticed something she'd completely overlooked. The soil looked darker than normal, and there were tiny patches of something growing around the edge of the feeding area. Sarah crouched down. At first, she thought it was simply grass. But when she looked closer, she realized it wasn't. There were small clusters of dark green growth around the damp areas near the trough. The previous week had brought several days of heavy rain. Water had been collecting around the feeding station. And because the trough sat in the same location every day, the ground rarely had time to dry properly. Sarah took a closer look at the wooden supports beneath the trough. They were damp. The surrounding soil was muddy, and there was a faint, musty smell. She immediately understood something important. The cattle weren't necessarily reacting to the hay itself. They could have been reacting to something around the feeding area. But Sarah didn't want to jump to conclusions. She cleaned the area completely. She moved the trough onto a dry, well-drained section of the pasture. Then she replaced the surrounding bedding and removed anything that looked contaminated. For the next few days, she watched carefully. And something remarkable happened. The cattle returned to their normal feeding behavior. But Sarah wasn't finished. She wanted to know why the problem had appeared so suddenly. Sarah began looking through her farm records. She checked when the feeding area had been moved, when the trough had been cleaned, when the rain had started, when the cattle's eating behavior changed. Then she saw it. There was a pattern. The cattle hadn't suddenly become picky. The environment around the feeding station had gradually changed. Repeated rainfall had created a damp area. The trough kept moisture trapped around the soil. Organic material accumulated, and the feeding area became increasingly unpleasant for the herd. The cattle had noticed the change long before Sarah did, and that realization surprised her, because farmers often watch their animals for obvious signs of illness. But animals can react to environmental changes long before humans notice anything unusual. Sarah had been looking at the cattle. The cattle had been telling her to look at the ground. Sarah decided to make one more change. She stopped treating the feeding area as a permanent fixture. Instead, she began rotating it. Every so often, the feeding location would change. The old area would be given time to dry. She improved drainage around the feeding stations, and she began inspecting the ground just as carefully as she inspected the feed. It seemed like a small adjustment, but within weeks, Sarah noticed something else. The cattle were calmer around feeding time. There was less pushing, less hesitation, and almost no wasted feed. Sarah had spent years thinking that the most important part of feeding cattle was the feed itself. But now she understood something different. Where you feed them can matter too. The cattle had never been trying to make her life difficult. They were responding to their environment. And once Sarah changed that environment, their behavior changed with it. From that point forward, Sarah created a simple routine. Every morning before feeding, she checked 3 things: the feed, the water, and the feeding ground. She looked for standing water, mud, unusual smells, mold or spoiled material, and anything else that could make the area uncomfortable or unsafe. She also stopped assuming that unusual behavior always meant the same thing. If one cow stopped eating, she watched that animal closely. If the entire herd behaved differently, she looked for something they might all be experiencing. That distinction became extremely useful, because when an entire herd changes behavior at the same time, sometimes the clue isn't inside the animals. It's somewhere around them. About a month later, Sarah had another heavy rainstorm. The next morning, she walked toward the feeding area. For a moment, she remembered what had happened before. She expected hesitation. Instead, the cattle came running. They moved toward the freshly positioned trough. They lowered their heads, and they started eating. Sarah stood there watching them. No hesitation, no walking away, no strange behavior, just a normal morning on the farm. And Sarah smiled, because this time, she had noticed the problem before the cattle had to tell her. The lesson Sarah learned wasn't that cattle are mysterious. It was almost the opposite. They were communicating the entire time. The problem was that Sarah had been looking for a complicated answer. Sometimes the clue is surprisingly simple. A strange smell, wet ground, a dirty corner, a change in routine, a place the animals suddenly don't want to stand. And when an entire herd suddenly refuses to eat, don't just look at what's inside the trough. Look at everything around it, because sometimes The cattle aren't refusing the food. They're warning you about the place you're feeding them. And Sarah would never look at a feeding trough the same way again.